Let me tell you about the single most embarrassing day in the 5,000-year history of the Galactic Accord Council. And I was there. I witnessed all of it. From the front row, with my 4 eyes wide open and my secondary jaw hanging so far down it nearly unhinged. I have lived through stellar collapses, species-ending plagues, and the great administrative disaster of Cycle 2200, where someone accidentally declared war on a gas giant. None of it, and I mean none of it, compares to what happened on the day the Council sent its most fearsome ultimatum to the tiny, wet, perpetually arguing species known as humanity. You have to understand the context. The Galactic Accord Council is not some backwater committee. It is the governing body of 47 recognized civilizations, spanning 6 galactic arms. It has a fleet numbering in the tens of thousands. It has ambassadors so ancient they remember when stars were young. It has a bureaucratic apparatus so thorough that a single formal declaration takes 3 standard years to approve, stamp, and deliver. When the Council speaks, civilizations listen. When the Council threatens, civilizations comply. That is simply how things work. That is how things have always worked. Except, apparently, nobody told Earth. The trouble started, as most galactic troubles do, with resources. Specifically, a field of rare isotopes sitting in a debris belt at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. A system Earth had, without asking anyone's permission, begun quietly mining about 14 of their years prior. Now, the Council had a long-standing claim on that belt. Did they have any active operations there? No. Had they visited it in the past 800 years? Also no. Was the claim documented in a filing that required 43 separate authorization codes to access? Absolutely yes. And that, from the Council's perspective, was more than sufficient. Councillor Vreth Omal, who represented the Damur Collective and who had personally overseen 4 civilization-level surrender negotiations, took the matter very personally. He stood before the full assembly, all 912 seats filled, every screen active, every recorder running, and he delivered what was, by all internal metrics, a masterwork of intimidation. His voice carried the resonant undertone frequency that for Damur signals absolute authority. His tendrils were fully extended in the dominance posture. He cited 17 precedents. He referenced 3 wars that had ended careers. He outlined the full scope of the Council's military capability in clinical, devastating detail. Then he transmitted the ultimatum to Earth. The full document was 630 pages long. It detailed, in exhaustive precision, exactly what the Council would do if humanity did not immediately cease operations, surrender all extracted materials, pay reparations in the amount of 40 billion standard credits, and issue a formal apology through the approved 17-stage diplomatic apology framework, which, I should mention, takes a minimum of 2 years to complete even when everyone is cooperating enthusiastically. The Council gave Earth 72 hours to begin compliance. There was a celebratory dinner that night. I attended it because I was the Accord's official xenosociological observer, which is a fancy title meaning I watched aliens do things and wrote reports about it. The mood was triumphant. Councillor Vreth Omal accepted congratulations with the practiced grace of someone who fully expected them. Someone brought out a fermented beverage that tasted like engine coolant and everyone pretended to enjoy it. Speeches were made. The general consensus was that this matter would be resolved within the week. I went to bed feeling vaguely uneasy. I had spent 11 years studying humanity. The others had not. The reply came in 19 hours. 19 hours. The Council had given them 72, and the humans, who, I should remind you, had never once participated in formal Accord diplomatic training, had no sitting ambassador at the time, and were technically still arguing amongst themselves about whether they even recognized the Council's jurisdiction, responded in 19 hours. The transmission arrived at 0340 station time, flagged urgent, routed directly to the main communications desk. The night officer, a young Pelhari named Suveth, received it first. She later told me she initially thought it was a data corruption error because the file size was so small she assumed the transmission had failed. It had not failed. The entire response, from the most powerful military diplomatic body in the known galaxy's ultimatum, demanding 630 pages worth of concessions, was 2 words. 2 words. Suveth stared at the screen for a full 4 minutes before she called her supervisor. Her supervisor, a veteran Accord communications officer named Prelin Joss, arrived, read the message, and then stood absolutely still for what witnesses described as a very long and very quiet moment. He then asked Suveth to please confirm the decryption had worked correctly. She confirmed it had. He asked if there had been any other attachments. She confirmed there had not. He looked at the screen one more time, and then he did something that nobody in the communications wing had ever seen a senior officer do at 0340 station time. He started laughing, not politely, not professionally. He sat down in Suveth's chair, put both his primary hands over his face, and laughed until his gill flaps were cycling in distress. Suveth, who was 22 years old and on only her second assignment, did not know what to do. She filed the message as received, marked it urgent escalate, and went to make herself a calming beverage. I found out about all of this at 0630 when my console lit up with 17 simultaneous priority flags. I read the message. I sat with it for a moment. I will be honest with you, I understood immediately. 11 years of studying humanity, and those 2 words told me everything about where this situation was going. I felt something I had not felt in a professional context in a very long time, which was a combination of second-hand embarrassment and profound, genuine awe. The 2 words were, in the human linguistic standard they had chosen to respond in, and they had chosen it deliberately, because English is the language humans use when they want to be absolutely certain there is no misunderstanding. The 2 words were, make us. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. 630 pages, 47 civilizations, 5,000 years of institutional authority, a fleet with a firepower index that could sterilize a planet in under an hour, 3 referenced wars, 17 cited precedents, Counselor Vreth Omal in his full dominance posture, tendrils extended, voice carrying the resonant frequency of absolute the Moor authority. Make us, not we respectfully decline, not we request additional time for review, not even a simple no, which would have at least been a complete sentence that the Council's legal team could work with. Make us, 2 words that translated, in every linguistic framework the Council's systems attempted, to the same meaning. We acknowledge your threat. We understand your power, and we are actively inviting you to try. Counselor Vreth Omal was briefed at A700. I was not in the room, but I have reviewed the security footage many times since then, for what I can only describe as educational purposes. He read the message, his tendrils retracted fully, which for Damour is the involuntary physical response to shock. He read it again. He set the datapad down on the table very carefully, the way one sets down something that one suspects might be dangerous. Then he turned to his aide, a meticulous young Damour named Korath Vey, and asked him to confirm the translation. Korath Vey confirmed it. Vreth Omal asked if perhaps the humans had included a longer response in an encrypted secondary layer. They had not. He asked if there was any chance this was a cultural idiom that translated differently in context. Korath Vey, to his considerable credit, looked his superior directly in the primary optical cluster and said, with remarkable composure, "No, Counselor. In context, I believe it means precisely what it says." There was an emergency session called for 0900. I attended as observer. The atmosphere was different from the previous evening's dinner, considerably different. The 912 seats were full again, but nobody was celebratory. The Council's lead strategist, an ancient and deeply respected Volhari named Isan Mar, had been pulled from her scheduled leave and arrived looking like someone who had been given a problem she had not expected to spend her retirement solving. The debate that followed lasted 6 hours. Here is what made it complicated, and what made it, from my observer position, deeply fascinating to watch. The Council was not afraid of humanity's military capability. They had run the numbers. Earth had orbital defense platforms, a modest interstellar fleet, maybe 200 warships, quality rated concerning but manageable by Accord standards, and a range of weapons systems that were inventive but not civilization-ending by galactic metrics. On paper, the Council could handle Earth. That was not the issue. The issue was a word that kept coming up in the session, spoken quietly at first, and then with increasing frequency by different voices from different civilizations. The word was doctrine, because here is the thing about the Galactic Accord Council that I had spent 11 years documenting, and that was now becoming urgently relevant. The Council's authority did not rest on its ability to destroy anyone. Any large enough fleet could do that. The Council's authority rested on the universal understanding that when the Council issued a formal ultimatum, the receiving party negotiated. Maybe they pushed back, maybe they stalled, maybe they made counter-offers or requested mediation or filed procedural objections that took decades to resolve. But they did not in 5,000 years, respond with 2 words that essentially translated to a physical challenge. If the Council moved against Earth now, with force, unprovoked except by a 2-word response to what was technically a legal notice, what did that say to every other civilization watching? What did it say to the species who were already skeptical of the Council's fairness? What did it say, most importantly, to the 43 other civilizations who had at one time or another received Council ultimatums and complied, not because they wanted to, but because they believed the institution was governed by process and not by raw force? Isan Mar said it plainly, in the silence after the 6th hour of debate, in the voice of someone who had seen enough history to recognize a pivot point when one appeared. If we respond with the fleet, we are no longer the Council. We are just another empire, and they will have made us say it without firing a single shot. The room was very quiet after that. I wrote 6 pages of notes in the silence. Meanwhile, on Earth, I was later able to piece together a woman named Petra Valkenburg, the director of the small, underfunded, perpetually understaffed office that Earth had somewhat optimistically titled the Department of Extraterrestrial Diplomatic Affairs, was sitting in a conference room in Geneva with 4 other people, a cold cup of coffee, and the fully conscious understanding that she had just sent 2 words to the most powerful governing body in the galaxy and was now waiting to find out what they would do about it. The other 4 people in that room were Ikaika Makoa, Earth's senior defense liaison, Nomvula Dube, the department's chief legal analyst, Fadl al-Rashid, the communications officer who had actually transmitted the message and who looked like he was reconsidering several of his life choices, and Yori Tanaka, who was ostensibly there as a strategic advisor but who had, by all accounts, spent the first 2 hours of the waiting period building an elaborate structure out of paper clips and absolutely refusing to discuss what would happen if the Council responded with the fleet. Petra Valkenburg, by contrast, was completely calm. She had been calm when she drafted the response. She had been calm when Fadl asked her 3 times if she was certain. She had been calm when she authorized the transmission, when the confirmation came back, and when the first tense hour passed without any sign of incoming ships. She sat at the head of the table with her cold coffee and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked, according to everyone present, like someone who had done the math and was comfortable with the answer. What was the math? I asked her that, later, much later, after everything had concluded. She looked at me with those calm, direct human eyes, and she said, "They built an institution. Institutions have rules. We read the rules." Simple as that. 11 years of study, and she had put it more cleanly than any of my reports. The Council was still deliberating. Earth was still waiting. And somewhere in the gap between those 2 facts, the entire future of humanity's relationship with the galaxy was being decided, not by warships and not by weapons, but by 2 words and the silence that followed them. The Council's deliberation stretched into its 2nd day. I want to paint you a picture of what that looked like from inside the Accord station, because it was genuinely one of the more surreal experiences of my professional life. 912 representatives from 47 civilizations, beings who had collectively overseen the rise and fall of dozens of smaller governments, who had signed treaties in the aftermath of actual interstellar wars, and they were all essentially stuck, paralyzed, staring at two words on a screen like they were a puzzle box that nobody had the manual for. Councillor Vretho Mal had stopped accepting visitors to his office. His aide, Korith Vey, was running diplomatic interference with the practiced exhaustion of someone who had been awake for 36 hours and had given up pretending otherwise. The Council's legal division had produced a 90-page analysis of the response, which concluded, after 90 pages, that the two words were technically not a refusal, not an acceptance, not a counter-offer, and not classifiable under any existing framework in the Accord's diplomatic codex. The lead legal analyst, a meticulous Harani named Bexolun, had apparently spent 4 hours searching for a precedent and had ultimately filed a supplementary note that said, in the careful language of someone who needed it on record, "This office has no applicable framework. We recommend creating one." That recommendation was tabled for review. Of course it was. Meanwhile, the news had leaked. I do not know who leaked it. I have my suspicions. There are always factions within the Council who benefit from instability, and a species that openly defied a formal ultimatum and survived was enormously useful political ammunition for anyone who had been arguing that the Council had grown too rigid, too slow, too imperial in its assumptions. Whoever did it, the result was immediate and galactic in scope. Within 18 hours of the leak, the transmission logs showed inquiry signals from 31 different civilizations, all requesting confirmation of the report. Several neutral observer species, including the notoriously reclusive Miniri, broke a silence of 200 years to transmit a single question to the Accord's public communications channel. The question was, did they actually say that? The answer, confirmed by 6 independent sources before the Council's communications office could even draft a response, was yes. The reaction across the galaxy was varied. That is the diplomatic way to put it. Among the species who had long-standing tensions with the Council, the Velhari frontier clans, the Orican autonomy, 3 of the 7 Junthe collectives, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. There were public celebrations on 2 Velhari worlds. The Orican autonomy's governing body issued a statement that was technically neutral, but used the phrase refreshing directness in a way that left absolutely no ambiguity about their opinion. Within the Accord itself, the smaller member civilizations, the ones who complied with Council ultimatums not out of agreement but out of necessity, went very, very quiet in the particular way that means everyone is thinking the same thing and nobody wants to say it first. Isan Mar, who was still technically on leave and therefore had the freedom to be more candid than her position usually allowed, requested a private meeting with me. We sat in one of the observation lounges on the station's outer ring, watching a nearby nebula do nothing in particular, and she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "The humans didn't threaten us. They reminded us of something we had forgotten. The only reason authority works is because the people under it believe it should. The moment they stop believing, the authority has to decide what it actually is." Then she finished her drink and told me that she was going back on leave and that I should write that down somewhere useful. I wrote it down. Back on Earth, the waiting had entered its 2nd day, and the mood in Petra Valkenburg's conference room had evolved. The paperclip structure that Yori Tanaka had been building was now architecturally ambitious enough that Namvula Dubé had photographed it twice. Faidal al-Rashid had stopped looking like he was reconsidering his life choices and had transitioned into the particular blank calm of someone who had fully accepted a situation he could not change. Ikaika Makoa had slept for 4 hours on the conference room couch and woken up in a better mood than anyone else present, which everyone agreed was deeply unfair. Petra had not left the building. She had changed her jacket, eaten 2 meals at the conference table, and continued to project a composure so complete that Namvula had quietly asked her, at one point, whether she was actually worried or whether something was medically wrong with her stress response. Petra had considered the question seriously and said, "I grew up on a fishing boat. You learn to wait." Namvula had not found this as reassuring as Petra intended. The council's decision came at hour 51. Not a fleet. Not a second ultimatum. Not even a formal escalation through the approved 17-stage response framework that Baek-seol-eun's legal team had spent 2 days arguing about. What arrived in Earth's diplomatic transmission queue was a single, relatively brief document, 42 pages, which by council standards was practically a sticky note, requesting that Earth send a representative to the Accord Station for direct talks. The language was formal, but carefully, deliberately stripped of the dominance phrasing that had characterized the original ultimatum. There was no reference to reparations. There was no reference to the 630-page document. There was, in the section that would have normally contained a deadline, a phrase that Baek-seol-eun's office had apparently argued about for 11 hours before agreeing on. The phrase was, "At Earth's earliest convenience." I read that phrase and I felt, I will be honest, something that I think humans would call a grin. My species does not have the same facial structure, but the internal sensation was equivalent. At Earth's earliest convenience, 5,000 years of institutional supremacy, and the Council had just used the politest possible language to ask humanity to please come talk. When they had a moment, no rush, Faisal al-Rashid read the transmission aloud to the room and then looked up and said, in a voice of profound bewilderment, "Did we just win?" Petra took her glasses off her forehead, put them on, and read the document herself from beginning to end. Then she set it down, picked up her cold coffee, still cold, possibly the same cup, and said, "We didn't win anything yet. We just got to the table." She was right, of course. She was irritatingly, consistently right. The delegation Earth sent to the Accord Station was 5 people, which the Council had clearly expected to be an insult, and then reconsidered when they realized they had no framework for deciding what size delegation was appropriate when the previous communication had been 2 words. Petra led it. Ikaika Makoa came as defense liaison. Namvula Dube came as legal counsel. They brought a linguist named Chidi Okafor, who spoke 9 languages and had spent 20 years studying Accord diplomatic communication patterns, and a young physicist named Reva Sidurth, who was there because she understood the isotope mining operation better than anyone else alive, and because Petra had decided that having the most technically knowledgeable person in the room was more useful than having an extra diplomat. I watched them come aboard the station. I was standing in the observation corridor above the main docking bay. Officially, I was there to observe and document. Unofficially, I had been awake for 20 hours because I did not want to miss this, and I watched the 5 of them walk off the boarding ramp and into the station's main concourse. They looked ordinary. That is the honest thing. By galactic standards, they were small, bilaterally symmetrical, soft-skinned, entirely unarmored. Chidi Okafor was telling a quiet joke to Reva Sidharth as they walked, and she was covering her mouth to keep from laughing at an inappropriate moment. Ikaika Makoa was looking around the concourse with the focused, methodical attention of someone cataloging exits and sightlines out of professional habit. Namvula Dube had a datapad in her hand and was already reading something on it. Petra Valkenburg was walking at the center of the group with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes forward, and she looked exactly like someone who belonged wherever she happened to be standing. The Council's reception delegation, 12 members, formal robes, full ceremonial configuration, was waiting at the end of the concourse. Korath Vey had organized it. He had clearly agonized over the protocol, because the setup was simultaneously formal enough to signal respect and stripped of enough traditional dominance elements to signal that this was not going to be another ultimatum. He had, I realized, threaded a very narrow needle. Petra walked up to the head of the reception line where Vreth Omal was standing, and she stopped and she looked up at him. He was nearly twice her height, with full tendrils and the bearing of someone who had not been looked at without deference in several centuries, and she said, in clear, unaccented standard accord, Thank you for having us. Not we are honored. Not the formal 18-word greeting that the Accord's diplomatic handbook recommended for first contact situations. Thank you for having us. 6 words. The kind of thing you say when someone invites you to dinner. Vreth Omal's tendrils did a small, involuntary thing that meant, in Thamur body language, something between surprise and recalibration. Then he inclined his head, a gesture his species reserves for acknowledged equals, and said, "Thank you for coming." Koreth Ve told me later that was not in the script. The talks lasted 9 days. I am not going to walk you through all 9 days, because large portions of them were genuinely tedious even by the standards of someone who finds diplomatic process interesting, and because the technical details of isotope extraction rights and territorial boundary revision are the kind of thing that makes even experienced legal analysts stare at walls. What I will tell you is the shape of it, because the shape was remarkable. Earth did not capitulate. They also did not posture. Riva Siddharth spent the first 2 days demonstrating, with meticulous technical precision, that the Accord's 800-year-old claim on the debris belt was based on survey data so outdated that it had failed to account for 3 significant gravitational shifts that had substantially altered the belt's composition and, by the Accord's own legal definitions, its classification. Bexal Un's team spent 1 full day attempting to find a counter-argument and produced, at the end of it, a document that Namvula Duba described to me as, technically, a concession dressed in 4 layers of procedural clothing. Namvula, I should say, was extraordinary in those talks. She had the rare and devastating skill of being able to cite the Accord's own regulations back at its representatives with a precision that made it impossible to argue without undermining the legitimacy of the very framework the Council depended on. She was polite throughout. She was always polite. She had a way of delivering a legal point that dismantled someone's position entirely while maintaining an expression of complete professional respect. And I watched Council representatives walk out of sessions looking like they had been very gently and thoroughly disassembled. Chidi Okafor, meanwhile, had apparently made friends with half the station in between sessions. I personally watched him spend an evening in the station's common area, teaching 3 Pelhari junior staff members a card game, and the laughter from that corner of the room was audible from across the space. Galactic diplomacy, in his approach, appeared to have very little to do with formal sessions. On the 7th day, Isen Mar came back from leave. She walked into the session room, took a seat on the Council side of the table, looked at Petra Valkenburg across the space between them, and said, "I've read the full brief. I think we've been having the wrong conversation." Petra said, "What's the right one?" Isen Mar said, "Partnership terms." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Petra uncapped her pen. She used a physical pen which had caused considerable fascination among the Council staff all week, and said, "I'm listening." The final agreement took 2 more days to draft and was 68 pages long, which Namvula noted was longer than Earth's response, but considerably shorter than the original ultimatum, and she said this to Faisal al-Rashid in a private message that I was absolutely not supposed to see, and that made me make the internal sensation that is equivalent to a grin for the 2nd time that week. Earth retained full operational rights to the debris belt under a joint classification revision that Riva Siddharth's technical data had made legally inescapable. The Accord received a formal, though notably non-apologetic, acknowledgement of the original territorial filing. A framework for Earth's future participation in Accord resource negotiations was established, giving humanity a seat at tables it had previously been excluded from entirely, and the Accord's legal division, under Bexal On's exhausted but thorough direction, began drafting a new response protocol for what the internal documentation carefully titled Non-Standard Diplomatic Communications. The non-standard communication in question, the 2-word one, was never formally addressed in the agreement. By mutual unspoken consensus, both sides had decided that some things were better left unarchived. On the 9th day, as the delegations were preparing to depart, I managed to get a few minutes with Petra Valkenburg in the corridor outside the main session room. I had my observer's datapad, and I had 11 years of study, and I had approximately 40 questions I had been saving up, and I asked her, the one that had been sitting at the top of the list since hour one. I asked her, "When you sent those 2 words, did you know it would work?" She thought about it. Not for long. Petra Valkenburg was not a person who needed long to find her answers, but she thought about it honestly, which I appreciated. She said, "I knew that they'd built something they cared about preserving, and I knew that the fastest way to make someone think clearly about what they've built is to make them choose between the building and the bulldozer." She paused. "We weren't the bulldozer, but we were willing to stand in front of one. That's different." She clicked her pen, put it in her jacket pocket, and went to collect her delegation. I stood in that corridor for a while after she left, writing notes that I knew were going to end up in the longest report of my career, thinking about 5,000 years of institutional history and 2 words that had quietly, irrevocably changed the shape of everything that came after them. Here is what I put at the top of that report. I want you to hear it, because I think it matters. Humanity is not the largest species in the galaxy. It is not the oldest, the most technologically advanced, or the most diplomatically experienced. It does not have the biggest fleet, the most territory, or the longest institutional memory. What it has, what I spent 11 years failing to fully appreciate and 9 days watching made undeniable, is a particular and remarkable refusal to accept the premise that size determines the terms. They read the rules. They held the line. They waited, in a conference room in Geneva with cold coffee and a paperclip sculpture, for an institution 5,000 years their senior to decide what it actually was. And when the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy asked them, at their earliest convenience, to come to the table, they showed up with a physicist, a lawyer, a linguist, a defense liaison, and a woman who grew up on a fishing boat. It was, in my professional assessment, more than enough.